I'm John Sullivan, and I'd like to welcome you to another Look At program. Tonight, something special, to me anyway, and I hope it will be special to the viewing audience and to the listening audience. As my guest, a former presidential press secretary. His name is Malcolm Mac Kilduff, and he has a very dubious distinction, which we'll get to later. And I would like to say at the outset that we were going to have some film on tonight, but as it turned out, the film was not available, and technical difficulties prevented us from having the film. But I would like to thank Mac, as he's known to his friends and to everyone else, I guess, and has been all his life, for even coming down to be on the show tonight. Before we get into any of this other stuff, Mac, I think we ought to just get some of your background to give our audience an idea of who Malcolm Kilduff is.
Well, aside from having been in the White House for 4 years, prior to that I'd spent 17 years, John, in the State Department.
This was a surprise to me until tonight you mentioned this.
I had been in the passport office of our State Department for a number of years, and then I was in the Bureau of Public Affairs, which afforded me a rather unique opportunity, especially in the early days of the Kennedy administration, of attending a number of foreign conferences with the then Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, in Bangkok for CETO and the Laotian and Disarmament conferences in Geneva, which was the work I was in immediately prior to going to the White House in 1962. So then after I stayed my years in the White House, and then I was in the public relations business, and then later on in the early 70s I was in television in Las Vegas. Most recently I was connected with the National Petroleum Council in Washington before moving to Kentucky and marrying a native of Kentucky, and now living in Beattyville. I'm very happy about it.
I must say that your wife Rosemary is a real credit to you.
She certainly is.
You have good taste.
Well, Rosemary and I have known each other for 32 years, and we decided we wouldn't rush into anything.
We might make mention that she has worked in Washington for 32 years too.
That's right. She worked. She and I first knew each other in 1945, and then Rosemary worked for Senator Earl Clements in Kentucky. She worked for Hubert Humphrey. And recently, before she retired, she worked for Senator Vance Harkey of Indiana.
Now, I will say, since we're into the program a little bit, that Mac is the one person who made the announcement to the world. It was in 1963, I think it was, wasn't it?
November 22nd.
November 22nd. That the late President John F. Kennedy had been shot, and later on that President John F. Kennedy was dead. He was the assistant press secretary at that time. Could you tell us, we may as well get to this right now, how this came about, that you as assistant press secretary?
Well, as most viewers who recall those days will remember, Pierre Salinger was the press secretary. He was on his way to Japan with Dean Rusk and the Secretary of Treasury Douglas Dillon. There was an economic conference to be held in Tokyo. Pierre had wanted to go on that trip to Japan, so he was asked to go along as the delegation spokesman, even though he was the White House spokesman. So it fell to me to take Pierre's place and be the press secretary on this friendly little trip to Texas, which included Houston, the Manned Spacecraft Center, and Fort Worth the day before moving on the morning of November 22nd to Dallas.
Can we start from the top of the motorcade? Could we start there, or do you want to go through that?
Yes, well, that's all right. Fine, John. Just stop me at any time. We flew from Amon Carter Field in Fort Worth, even though it was very close to Dallas, over to Love Field, where the motorcade formed up for the trip through Dallas. Now, if you might remember at that time, there was a great deal of what you might call, from a political point of view, far right-wing activity going on, mostly under the banner of those who were supporting Senator Barry Goldwater. And it found a home in Dallas. So when we arrived in Dallas, I said to several people on the plane, I'll be rather glad when this segment of the trip is over. I was concerned about it, but concerned about it from a political standpoint. I don't mean that I was foreseeing any tragedy.
You had no premonitions whatsoever?
No, I did not. No, that would, I felt uneasy about it, but certainly not to the extent that we later found out we should have expected. So as we went through the streets of Dallas after forming up the motorcade in Love Field, I was in the third car behind the president in the motorcade with United. It was in the press pool car, because he always carries a car very close to the front of the motorcade, with Merriman Smith of United Press, Jack Bell, Associated Press, Bob Baskin of the Dallas Morning News, and Bob Clark of American Broadcasting Company. And as we were going through the streets of Dallas, we saw very few of the evidences, rather, of the far right. I mean, few Goldwater signs.
Signs of dissension.
Yes. In other words, we had seen signs before, even in Fort Worth, critical of the president's actions in Cuba, for instance. So we were driving through Dallas, and I just had turned to Merriman Smith, and I said, this is a much better reception than I had expected. And we were just making a left turn in front of the Texas School Book Depository.
Now, who was in the cars ahead of you, between you and the president?
Between me and the president, there was the Secret Service follow-up car, and then the car with Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird, and Ralph Yarborough, the then senator from Texas, senior senator from Texas. Then the press pool car. So when we heard the first shot, or the first sound, Merriman Smith said, "What was that?" And I can recall very clearly my thinking. I remember that we were only a week away from Thanksgiving, and that fireworks are sold pretty freely in Texas that time of year, on Christmas and Thanksgiving. And I said, it sounded to me like a firecracker. So within that time frame, when you recreate that, there's about 6 to 6.5 seconds elapse, no matter how you time that. Then there was the second report, and then just 2 or 3 seconds after that, the third.
You mean, you're talking about shots?
Now, at that point, to dispel any notion, and they often talk about shots that were off ahead of the motorcade, coming towards the motorcade, up on the so-called grassy knoll. My instinct, I was sitting in the right-hand front seat. I looked over and above my right shoulder, which was directly into the windows of this Texas School Book Depository.
Now, you had a glass-top car?
No, we had a
convertible?
No, a Southwest Bell telephone car. It was owned by Southwest Bell.
You were riding what they call a shotgun then?
That's right, yeah.
In the right
front seat.
Okay.
The window was open. The shots were clearly from to my right and above and to the rear. So
you could lean out the window and look.
And look up. Now, I could not see anything in that window. Mm-hmm. The cars sped up at that point, and you could tell they were shots. But even at that point, no one in the press pool car knew, nor did we imagine, that the president had been shot. That was probably the last thing in any one of our minds. We did speed off, we accelerated, but that would have been normal to get out of a troublesome situation, although it had never happened before. We went past the Trade Mart where we would have the luncheon, and I asked my driver, who was an employee of Southwest Bell Telephone, where are we off to? He said, it looks to me like we're going to Parkland Hospital. So we pulled up in back of Parkland Hospital into the emergency entrance.
Now, how much time had elapsed since then?
Well,
since the time that you asked the driver, where are we off to?
From the time of the shots?
Right.
Probably 3 to 4 minutes. We were at the hospital within about 10, 12 minutes at the most.
So it was actually 3 minutes then before they realized that anything was going on?
No, we started to speed up. But it was not until after we went under the bridge and past the Trade Mart. You see, we would have turned in there because that's where he was to speak. As we went by the Trade Mart, then I knew we were not going to the Trade Mart.
Okay.
It was at that point that I asked him, where could we be going? He said, Parkland Hospital. Must be going to Parkland Hospital. Someone must be hurt. Now, none of us knew at that point that the president had been shot. No one in that motorcade other than the people in that car, and possibly the Secret Service men in the follow-up car, knew that the president had been shot. You've heard stories that it was known that he was shot. It was not known. It was not known until we reached the hospital. Merriman Smith of United Press did grab the only phone in the car.
Now, I want to save that because that's the very important thing I want to ask you about.
All right, fine. And we went directly to Parkland Hospital, jumped out of the car, and ran over to the president's car and saw that his head was in Mrs. Kennedy's lap, and his head was covered with blood. At that point, they were racing out with a stretcher to take on wheels to take him into the emergency entrance. My first thought was we had to get phones for the wires, so I ran into the hospital to find telephones for AP and UP. And also one of my first thoughts was recalling back to the time when President Eisenhower had his heart attack out in Denver. The fact that it was a long process at a hospital, and where could I find a newsroom? Where could we find a place to respond to the queries of the press? Where could we establish a press headquarters? Where could we get telephones for the press? Anticipating at that point a long wait and probably a long healing procedure. So within that 40-minute period between the time when we actually got to the hospital until the time I had to make the announcement of the death and found out about the death, we were still anticipating setting up a headquarters. Well, then I went down finally. The bus with the rest of the pool came up. A couple of people that worked for us, Wayne Hawks. I asked him to go and find a classroom for a press room, and I went back down to try to find out what I could tell the press about the president's condition. Well, the president was dead, of course. He'd been killed for all practical purposes almost instantly. He was pronounced dead at approximately 1 o'clock, but that was a time just to put in a death certificate because for all practical purposes he was dead the moment the bullet hit him. As that old Zabruta film would show, the whole left side of his head was just blown right out. So, but we then I went and gathered all the data that I could on the condition of the president and what I could tell the press. But in the meantime, I went up and I had to get the permission, obviously, of the new president, Lyndon Johnson.
Well, he wasn't president yet, though.
No, but as I say, for all practical purposes, he was president. So I went up to him and I said, Mr. President, and Lady Bird screamed. Because he had been tucked back in that room and nobody apparently had bothered to tell him that John Kennedy was dead. And that, with the exception of taking the oath of office, he was the President of the United States. I asked him if I could go ahead and make the death announcement. And he said, no. He said, we don't know what they're up to. Not knowing who the they were. We don't know who else they might be trying to get after. He said, I think I'd better get back to the plane. He said, you wait until I get out of here and then you make the announcement. So the Secret Service and myself, we took President Johnson and Lady Bird out to his car. There was mass confusion. By that time, all the press were out at the emergency entrance. And in a moment of utter confusion and chaos, with the press all grabbing me, wanting to know what the president's condition was, and my not saying a word until we got Johnson clear, and on the way back and under the security of Air Force One, we raced them right by the press. And some of the press to this day, even though they have seen pictures of themselves right next to Lyndon Johnson, don't remember seeing him. And we got him clear of Parkland Hospital. He got back to Air Force One, and then at 1:31 Dallas time, I made the announcement that President John F. Kennedy had died.
Now, Mac, that must have been probably the most traumatic thing that's ever happened to you in your entire career. There's no doubt about that.
Oh, there's absolutely no question about it.
Can you think back? What were your thoughts at that particular time, or did you even have time to gather your thoughts?
I really didn't
act on instinct and something.
You do act on instinct, John. There was no question about what my thoughts were. My thoughts were of Mrs. Kennedy.
Go ahead and light up.
My thoughts did go to her and to the children, and to Rose Kennedy, who at that time had already lost one son, Joe, who had been killed. And frankly, all I could think of at that point was the need to get the information out, the need to be of whatever assistance I could in helping Lyndon Johnson.
Now let's go back a little bit, because I want to recreate something that might be a little bit humorous to the listening audience too, even and this whole chaos, especially to the news media people. Because as you said, Merriman Smith and Jack Bell, opposite ends of the spectrum there as far as wire services go,
that's right,
were in the car.
That's right.
And I've heard one story, so I would like for you to clarify it. There was one telephone in the center.
Well, there was one telephone in the center of the Southwestern Bell telephone car. I might say, never again did we travel with one phone. Because Merriman Smith, when he realized what was happening, reached down between his legs and got a hold of the telephone, got a hold of the mobile operator.
Okay, go ahead.
So he got the local UPI number in Dallas and started painstakingly dictating the fact bulletin. Shots had been fired at the president's motorcade. President Kennedy has been fired upon. So he kept that phone in his hand. Now, as we were driving along, we kept going under underpasses. And
he kept fading out.
And he kept fading out, or so he thought, and then he would insist that the UPI office read back what he had dictated. Now, he knew full well, because Merriman Smith and I discussed it many times, he knew full well what he was doing, and that was he was shafting Jack Bell of Associated Press, who was in the back seat, screaming his head off to get a hold of the phone, like you wouldn't believe. So finally, after about 8 to 12 minutes, almost to Parkland Hospital, we were just pulling up in the Parkland Hospital, Jack Bell reaches over into the front seat from the back seat, grabs the telephone away from Smith, calls him every name in the book, and reaches back and is going to zap Merriman Smith right in the head, but Merriman Smith was still smarter, and he ducked. So who gets hit in the head? The guy sitting next to Merriman Smith, me.
Mac killed him.
But that was a moment in American journalism, because Merriman Smith won the Pulitzer Prize for his coverage.
Well, I had heard that the phone was sitting between them, and Merriman Smith reached for the phone first, and Jack Bell's hand landed on top of his.
No, Jack Bell was in the back seat of the car. Merriman Smith and I were in the front seat of the car.
Okay.
And Smitty just grabbed that phone, and he hung on to it, and he kept dictating and adding and re-adding and getting him to read back to it. And of course, UPI was, as I say, about 10 to 12 minutes ahead of AP on it, because Jack Bell couldn't get the phone, and when he finally did get it, the only thing he did with it was hit me in the head with it.
Let's get back to Parkland Hospital again, because at that point, you said that you got President Johnson to Air Force One and Lady Bird. Now, had the doctors made any announcement to you that he was dead, officially?
No, the doctors did not. Dr. Perry, Malcolm Perry, had told me that he was dead. It was then that I got in touch with the president's physician who was on the trip, Admiral Berkeley. I asked him to give me what wording I could use in announcing the president's death. The only thing we could say at that point was that he had died of a gunshot wound in the brain, which was precisely my words, and I jotted it down on a piece of paper and read from that slip of paper when I made the announcement.
Did you feel like that you were disoriented at that particular time, Mac? Or did you feel like that you handled yourself and...
I don't remember how I felt, John. It's one of those things of If you've ever been in an automobile accident, when you try to make an accident report, you can't remember everything.
It's hard to do.
As I recall, everyone was massed in that was a nurse's instructional room at the hospital. All I can remember is just seeing a sea of faces and flashbulbs going off of my making the announcement and film rolling. And they're asking questions about what was the condition of Mrs. Kennedy, what was the condition of Governor Conley, who of course had also been shot. And I had his press secretary, by that time I'd found him, Bill Stinson, and he later gave a briefing on John Conley's condition. What was the condition of, and I don't know, I think one newsman actually had the stupidity to ask me, how is Jackie taking all this?
Oh my God! I think your husband.
Yeah, I think it was, especially when his head's blown off in your lap. That was about the worst question I got.
But now you go to the plane. Now you get Lyndon Johnson and you get Mrs. Johnson and probably some of his entourage on the plane. Now Tommy Carter, a friend of mine who writes for the Herald Leader, wrote a story about you last week. He and another contemporary of his wrote the story. And they mentioned that you happened to have a dictating machine, or you happened to see one when you got back on the plane there?
That's right. When we got on the plane, we had called for a judge, district court judge, Sarah Hughes, who, strangely enough, had been appointed as a result of Lyndon Johnson's intercession with President Kennedy, had been appointed a district court judge. She came out to the plane, and there was a Bible in the president's stateroom, and she swore Lyndon Johnson in on Air Force One. He felt, and it was felt also by members of the National Security Council back in Washington, with George Bundy among them, that it was imperative that Lyndon Johnson be sworn in as quickly as possible in the event that this was some sort of an international conspiracy. And he was sworn in then on Air Force One. Well, I suddenly realized we had no cameras aboard. We had Captain Stoughton of the White House Communications Agency, who was the official photographer. He took the pictures of the swearing in, and all I could think of was we didn't have any sound on film. So I grabbed on the president's table in the president's stateroom, it was a dictaphone machine. So I turned on the dictaphone machine, praying it was going to work, and put my hand up into the picture. If you've ever seen that picture of the swearing in, you'll see that there's a hand. Well, if you see the full picture, you can see somebody ducking way down trying to stay out of the picture, holding a microphone up, which I did. And I then took that dictabelt and gave it to Captain Stoughton, told him to get off Air Force One, take the pictures that he had made, and the belt, AP and UP, get them to develop the picture, get them to dupe this dictabelt in hopes that I had the swearing in, have it transferred to tape, sound tape, to get out to the various networks, which he did do, and we did have. That's how we obtained the voice transcription of Lyndon Johnson taking the oath of office from Sarah Hughes in the cabin of Air Force One.
Now, I want to ask you also, because there have been reports, and you flew back to Washington on Air Force One then,
that is correct,
with then President Johnson. And I understand, I don't know whether you know anything about it or not. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But I understand that Mrs. Kennedy opened the door to her bedroom on the plane. And here's Lyndon Johnson lying on the bed. And she says, "Oh, I almost forgot." And he supposedly made a remark, and don't you ever forget it, that he was not president. Do you know of anything like this happening?
The only thing I can tell you is that Lyndon Johnson never went in that bedroom. Mrs. Kennedy went into that bedroom immediately on returning to Air Force One. She, Kenneth O'Donnell, who was the president's aide, who just recently died, by the way, I read in the paper, was a great friend of mine who was on that trip. I went back and I said to Kenny, President Johnson would like Mrs. Kennedy up at the swearing in with him. She came forward into what was known as the staff cabin of the plane, where we had enough room for the swearing in to take place by a table out in the staff cabin. President Johnson took the oath with her standing next to him. She returned to that cabin and sat in that cabin the rest of the way back. President Johnson did not go into that cabin. He went in to see her. The thing that he was... it galls me every time I hear these stories, John, because I've always said that the afternoon of November 22nd was Lyndon Johnson's finest hour. Now, I know that Lyndon Johnson's had the reputation of being somewhat crude. Well, there was nothing crude about that man. As we were flying back to Washington, he gave me instructions, not from the presidential bedroom, but from out in the staff cabin, to get a hold of Mrs. Kennedy by phone, get a hold of Senator Teddy Kennedy, get a hold of Bobby Kennedy, so he could talk to them personally from the plane, which he did do, and I placed the calls through the Air Force switchboard in Washington to each and every one of those and monitored every one of those calls. So this idea of Lyndon Johnson being gross and lacking in consideration of any member of John Kennedy's staff is 100% crap. He was a total gentleman the entire way.
Oh, I'm glad you cleared that up.
No, that is absolutely wrong. I think he did go back to the cabin to talk to Mrs. Kennedy, and when they arrived back at Andrews Air Force Base, he waited to get off the airplane until she got off, until she was ready to get off, and he wanted to get off the plane. But that was as a courtesy to her, not because he was trying to rob the limelight or anything else. It was strictly he was a man totally shocked by what had happened that day, as we all were, and was showing consideration for a woman who'd been through a horrendous experience. So any implication that Lyndon Johnson was less than a gentleman can only be a figment of the imagination or some diabolical reason of the detractors of Lyndon Johnson.
Now, let's go back, because you said that you heard 3 shots in Dallas. And according to the story that Tommy wrote in the Herald last Friday, you were not interviewed whatsoever by the Warren Commission.
Never.
Was there ever any reason given why you weren't?
I never asked. I never asked the Warren Commission. I don't know. On reconstruction of the motorcade, you'll find that my position in the motorcade was closer to the gun than any other position in the motorcade, because it was right above my right shoulder, and I was sitting in the right front seat of the car next to the window from which the shots came. I don't know why the Warren Commission had it.
Do you believe
but I don't say, when I tell you that, I don't want you to assume that I therefore condemn the Warren Commission or its findings.
My question was going to be, do you believe the Warren Commission report, that there was one person acting solely by himself, as Lee Harvey Oswald was convicted, supposedly was the person who did it?
I have absolutely no doubt but that there was one person, one gun, and that it was Lee Harvey Oswald.
No conspiracy whatsoever?
I feel no conspiracy about it whatsoever. The so-called man on the knoll, I saw the man on the knoll, the man who was running. He was running to push 2 children down to get out of the line of fire, because the Secret Service men on the follow-up car were all drawing their guns, looking around to see where the shot came from, because we were in that bowl there at Dealey Plaza, and the echoes, it wasn't clear where the shots were coming from the men in that car. And I talked to the Secret Service men who were on there, including Clint Hill, who ran ahead and jumped on the back of the president's car with Mrs. Kennedy to get in to protect them.
Can you believe then that Jack Ruby acted on his own volition and belief for shooting Lee Harvey Oswald?
Yes, that happened on Sunday morning. I was in the car with Billy Graham, of all people. We were driving up to the Capitol where the president was lying in state when that happened. I've known people, and I remember when we heard it on the radio in the White House car. We got a signal that something had happened in the jail. And we got it right on the radio, and it said that a man by the name of Jack Ruby had shot him. Well, we all just about had a stroke because the signal corps officer we left in Dallas was named Jack Rubley. Without, you get the L in there. There was no connection, of course, but that was the first thing we heard. But it was, as I say, there was absolutely no connection at all. But yes, I think that Jack Ruby, from the people I've talked to, again acted on his own in his sleazy little bar in Dallas.
Okay, let me say
he
this.
He had
now.
Pictures of the Kennedys all over the place. He was known as, this may sound disrespectful at this time, but he was a Kennedy nut. I mean, in other words, he just had pictures of Jackie and pictures of President Kennedy all over his bar, and he was just thoroughly devoted to the idea of John F. Kennedy.
One other thing I'd like to ask you about the Kennedy-Johnson relationship. Prior to that election, prior to the nomination in Los Angeles, in the primary, or in the polls that showed, Johnson was way ahead. What kind of a deal? Were you with Johnson or Kennedy?
I didn't join. I didn't become associated with President Kennedy at all until 1961, when I did his advance work for him in Paris when he was then president. See, I was in the State Department at the time.
Do you know then of any deal that was made between Lyndon Johnson and John Kennedy? Because Johnson had said that he would not accept the second spot on the ticket. He was ahead in the polls. He probably could have been elected anyway, regardless. And here all of a sudden, out of the convention comes Jack Kennedy on the #1 spot, Lyndon Johnson on the second spot.
Yeah, but John Kennedy had his delegates already lined up. Johnson was saying he did, but he didn't. Kennedy knew he had an exact count. Bobby Kennedy and Teddy Kennedy and Kenneth O'Donnell, people of that type, Ted Sorensen, Pierre Salinger, who were all then working, I've talked to them many times since then. He knew exactly where his delegates were. And so did Lyndon Johnson.
So there was no deal then?
There was no deal. You mean for Johnson candidates?
Johnson?
Johnson, no.
The switch off there?
No, none at all. Absolutely none at all. And of course, it made a strong ticket. It made a ticket that was a winnable ticket. And you, as you well know, it was a mighty, mighty close vote.
Yeah, it really was.
It wasn't an easy vote at all. And I don't think that John Kennedy would have been elected President of the United States in 1960 had it not been for Lyndon Johnson, and I think John Kennedy knew that. He carried states that he could not have carried without Lyndon Johnson, because of his Northeast background, and also because, and we have to face it, we have to call a spade on this one, and because of his Roman Catholicism.
Do you think John Kennedy was a great president?
I don't think he had time to be. I think that he probably would have been if he'd lived. But I don't say that in any way detracting from John Kennedy. John Kennedy had great ideas and great programs that he wanted to in the peaceful way.
The last 10 seconds of this interview are distorted and garbled.